welcome to the inaugural event of the Australian and New Zealand chapter of AI4LAM. My name is Alexis Tindall and I am the Manager of Digital Innovation here at the University of Adelaide. As I open today's discussion, I'd like to acknowledge the Kaurna people, the original custodians of the Adelaide Plains and the land on which the University of Adelaide is built, from which I'm joining you today. I recognise that today we have participants from all over Australia and New Zealand and the US, I see from the chat as well. And so I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia, pay our respects to their elders past and present, and extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that are joining us today. Adam?
Cool, yeah. Kia ora, e ngā mana, e ngā reo, e ngā waka, e rā rangatira mā, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Kia ora everyone, I'm Adam Moriarty. I am Head of Collection, Information and Access at Tamaki Paingahira, Auckland War Memorial Museum. It's a pleasure to see so many Ingrids joining us today, and yeah, fascinating. I guess really excited to be here on the sort of first chat with all of you, and in the AI4LAM chapter. So I see myself very much starting in the journey here, so able to ask some of the beginner questions for Thomas. Alexis, did you have any other? Or do you want me to jump in?
Just wanted to perhaps welcome everybody on behalf of this emerging chapter. As Adam says, we're beginners in this space, filled with enthusiasm and interest, and hoping to bring together our collective knowledge to progress this discussion in Australia and New Zealand, and also benefit from the international community that we can connect with through this network. AI4LAM is an international participatory community focused on advancing the use of artificial intelligence in, for and by libraries and archives and museums. It's a broad network of cultural heritage professionals and those with an interest in sharing ideas and information about computational methods that can underpin cultural heritage best practice. We will be recording this morning's conversation. As I indicated a little bit earlier, for anyone who's joined lately, we're all joining as Ingrid Mason this morning because of a slight technical difficulty with our Zoom link. Feel free to rename yourselves, but I'm just asking participants who are not panelists to keep their video off and keep themselves on mute. So we are recording online and it will be posted online soon. If you are comfortable to, please introduce yourself in the chat window. Adam and I will be leading this conversation with our special guest, but questions from the audience are welcome at any time. If you'd like to ask a question, given that the chat looks quite busy, please use the Q&A function, which you should find at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Our colleagues Ingrid Mason, the original Ingrid Mason, and Jean Melchak will be keeping an eye on those questions and making sure that any come to our attention as need be. Adam, would you like to give us a little bit of background on Thomas, please?
Kia ora. So we're very lucky to have Thomas here with us today. So Thomas is the Interim Head of Knowledge Production at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. He consults, publishes, presents and teaches widely on digital strategy, cultural heritage collections, data literacy, digital scholarships and data curation. And in addition to being the author of the recently published Library Community Research Agenda, which I have my copy here, well thumbed, which is called Responsible Operations, Data Science, Machine Learning and AI in Libraries. He's also been integral to the development and delivery of the Collections as Data initiative. And so really excited to hear from Thomas and sort of help us on our journey. I guess if I can kick off with the first question, which hopefully nice easy one for you, is just thinking about what project work and curation and I guess computer techniques that have really sort of piqued your interest and have made you reflect or even dream a little about the transformation of heritage collections and humanity research.
Thanks, Adam. That's it's an interesting question to start with. I like the part about dream. It's always good to have a little dream, even though it kind of feels like the world is on fire lately. Yeah, I mean, there are a number of projects out right now that I think are particularly interesting. You know, over here in the United States at the Smithsonian, I really like Rebecca Dykow's work. She primarily because she's been working with insect collections at scale and plant collections at scale using neural networks to essentially describe plants from images of plants with a high degree of accuracy. And I've just been interested in that one recently, one, because it is an example from museums, but it's also an example applied to content that doesn't typically get discussed in digital humanities conversations. So I think that's an interesting one. I think another interesting project that's had me excited, again, because it's a different kind of content than typically gets discussed, is called Project AMP at Indiana University. They received some funding from the Mellon Foundation, and they're using a mix of commercial and open source techniques to describe audiovisual collections at scale computationally. Those are both interesting. And then I think more on like a social level, there's a project here in the States called the Colored Conventions Project, which focuses on 19th century African-American political organizing. And I've really appreciated the way that they've approached their project in terms of the putting the brakes essentially on computation over collections. So they have things that would be equivalent to terms of use, like if you want to use data that's been produced out of their project that call for you to respect Black lives, to adhere to certain patterns of attribution. So it's like, I guess I would introduce those two examples that make me excited, because two are really sort of like pushing the limits into different cultural heritage content types. And then another one is very sort of emphatically reminding the community that the data are not just data, that the data represent lives, and that there are particular responsibilities and legacies of oppression that need to be contended with. So it's not all utopian thinking, and I think that that's actually a really good thing.
I'm just thinking, as you talk about these projects, it would be good if we will try and share the links to them in the chat. And I think Jean's already on there doing that. I also think it's, I really love that, talking about the natural science collections here at Auckland Museum. We have a huge natural science collection, and the possibilities there, there's a huge potential with the size of those collections. And it's really interesting to find a project that isn't just, looking slightly different. And that idea of some kind of terms of use is something that definitely we're looking at here with indigenous data. Like how can we protect? And sometimes we see that shiny thing and we just kind of want to jump straight in. And so it's really, really nice to hear that there are examples out there of putting the brakes on and taking a slow and steady approach. So
yeah. I mean, with respect to the brakes, the principal investigator of that project is Gabrielle Coleman. And we'd actually invited her to a national forum that sort of kicked off the collections as data work in the United States. And we asked for position papers. And she and a collaborator put forward a position paper. I didn't include the link. I can include the link later. That was quite critical of the concept of collections as data, and sort of the uncomfortable way that, if we're thinking about, say, like spreadsheets of collection metadata or something like that, and we're talking about making them machine actionable and, doing computation upon them, they made a pretty clear link between that and ledgers that were used to traffic in human bodies during the Atlantic slave trade. Yeah. And really how we needed to think carefully and critically about some of the language around potential and opportunity around computational use with cultural heritage.
I understand, Adam, that the Auckland Museum has done some explorations in that area. Would you like to share any of your observations on the responsible use, particularly when it comes to Indigenous collections that you've explored there?
Yeah, I mean, so I think so. Auckland Museum has a really great cultural permissions policy, which is based around right now images, and so appropriate use of images of Māori or Moana Pacific peoples. And we have a process that makes sure that even though something may be in the public domain, may be open, it is a curatorial review and a community review to make sure that we're not encouraging misuse. And I really think the next step for us is to look at how we bring that into the data that we have. And I do love that idea that Thomas said, that it's very easy for us to slip in and think that this is just an Excel sheet, full of rows and rows of data, and we can filter and sort and do all sorts. And actually there's real meaning and story behind each of those cells. And so for, here at Auckland Museum and within, I think, the New Zealand context, we are working on that cultural permissions, but we're nowhere near finished yet. And I'm happy to share within the chat the links to our cultural permissions policy so you can all have a look and share that.
Yeah. Thomas, a couple of our team members were quite taken with your comment in the Responsible Operations report that producing machine actionable collections is simultaneously hyped for its potential to support research and relegated to the corner as an unsustainable boutique operation. Through this process, what have you learned about advocating for AI in practice, especially as part of core business?
That's another really pressing, essential question. I think practical question. And I would say, at least for myself, my own experience, it's still sort of to be determined. I do have an active project currently called Collections as Data Part to Whole that's funded by the Mellon Foundation here in the United States. It's primarily a regranting project. And essentially what we've done is we've secured money from the foundation to then give it away to 12 different institutions in the United States to develop models for the production of machine actionable collections and service models as well that are ideally multi-departmental in nature and have a disciplinary scholar built into each project. So, your question of how to do this work sustainably, we've tried to spark other institutions in the United States, large institutions and very small institutions, libraries, museums, and historical societies to try and answer the question that you just asked me. At a recent professional development institute that we've held for our second cohort of teams that we're funding, one of our expert instructors, who is actually a grantee in the first cohort, she's an associate university librarian, Maria Estorino, at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. She really focused on the idea of radical collaboration, which she draws from some of Nancy McGovern's work. And she talked through how important it was in order to sustain their work. And that project has recently gotten another grant from a different agency post-receiving funding from our project. So they're carrying the work forward farther. How important it was to sort of set up productive structures for cross-departmental, not even just cross-departmental, but cross-division collaboration, especially when parties to the collaboration have very different skill sets and interests. So we've required that each of the grantee teams have to include a senior administrator, a project lead, and a disciplinary scholar, so that there is an administrative advocate, there's someone who manages the day-to-day operation, and then there's a disciplinary perspective that really drives the project. So we're still waiting to learn. I would have had more to say on that point, at least from the perspective of the first 6 institutions that are developing the models. But COVID struck. Their projects were supposed to be finished in, I think 2 or 3 months ago, but we granted no-cost extensions to all of those projects. So our answers on that point are kind of TBD. One last thing, I'm thinking of getting kind of pretty long-winded, admittedly, on this one, because it's a hard question, but I think it's the question that's on everyone's mind. I think one of the things that I've seen projects be most successful is when they can satisfy, say, a research need or a quote-unquote boutique need, while at the same time delivering on a fundamental need. So a project that I like to talk about a lot is one at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln called Project Ada. And they're primarily working with the Chronicling America collection, which is a national newspaper digitization effort. Huge corpus at this point from multiple states in the United States. It's a collaboration between the libraries and a computer scientist, where they wanted to use computer vision to see if they could detect poetry in the Chronicling America corpus by looking at atypical distributions of white space on a page, which is kind of genius if you think about it, because poetry will look differently regularly on a page in terms of the space that it takes up, which is really cool. It's like computer science, there's computer vision happening, poetry is going to be found, which is really neat, right? But in the end, what is the other benefit that project can deliver? It can make poetry discoverable to people who just want to find poetry.
Yeah. We've had a question come in from the audience that says, how does an institution go from having digital collections to having collections as data? Where do we start?
That's a great question. I would point you to, so I was the PI of a project before, a Mellon project called Always Already Computational Collections as Data. And one of the deliverables that we produced in response to this exact question was called the 50 Things. So it's literally just a list of 50 unordered things of various complexity that you could do to get started with collections as data at your institution. Everything from having a reading group to having structured conversations between digital collections and say liaisons at your library, to doing some more complex work around thinking through requirements for an API.
Mm. We had, so Adam, did you have a question? So that sort of, you were thinking about talking about how this crosses departments as well. Did you have any observations on your experience with that, Adam?
Yes, well, I was actually going to flip there. That sort of, you've sort of started talking about how we set this up, and I think many organizations do have, you know, there's the skills and the resources that are required to work on these projects and to extract the knowledge from these different data sets is going to be split across maybe an ICT department, a digital department, the library, you know, for a museum, a curatorial department. And it can be really challenging, I think, to get these key staff to recognize the potential contribution of each. And yeah, really, again, so you started talking about this, but in order to set up a collaborative project that delivers those positive outcomes, yeah, what do you have any advice on how we could set that up? I mean, you sort of gave a bit of a structure there. Was that just in one team, or how do we look at that across an entire organization?
Yeah. So I would talk again a little bit about the UNC one, the UNC project, because that's fresh in my mind. It's called On the Books, Jim Crow and the Algorithms of Resistance. And that's a collaboration between a group of archivists and special collections librarians and a digital scholarship department, and a disciplinary scholar as well. And I think one of the things that Maria Estorino really emphasized that was important in that collaboration between those areas with like different specializations and different resources was this notion of radical collaboration and really being intentional about creating opportunities to draw upon the expertise of everyone in the collaboration. I think that, you know, speaking more generally, what we can see sometimes is that in projects like this, or in digital humanities efforts, for example, that I don't know what the right way to say it is. I'm trying to think of like a metaphor or something, but I guess I'll just describe it. But, you know, it's just like when half the collaboration, it's kind of felt that like they are the ones who have the technical skills. And then it's like the other half, it's like maybe you meet once and then there isn't a lot of intentional work around honoring the expertise that the other party in the collaboration has, whether or not that's deep relationships with the community that you're trying to engage, or deep knowledge of the institution or the collections. So I think that one of the things that Maria really emphasized is that you have to have structure within the collaboration. So oftentimes there's a lot of discussion about how to project manage a project, and like, especially if IT is involved, how to design a system and how to come up with functional requirements and, you know, things like that. But kind of what can come by the wayside is like the people element of actually trying to encourage people to talk to each other and use each other, right?
Yeah.
And trust each other. Like that.
Yeah.
That's a really hard one.
I think it's also, it's an area that I found interesting, where from my experience working on collaborative projects like that, where you're working across people who are managing collections and researchers, and people who are coming with the technical skills, is that issue that sometimes we're separated by a common language, that actually we're not necessarily coming from the same understanding of what we're trying to do. We're not necessarily coming from the same understanding of what data is and how data can be used. Is that something that's reflected in your own experience as well? And how do we bridge those cultural gaps?
Yeah, I definitely so. I think that, you know, one of the big sort of pain points can be you know, the conversations about scale and different professional cultures, even within librarianship. You know, subcultures within librarianship have different ideas of like what scale means. And it was really interesting in the past year of developing the community research agenda that Adam referenced toward the beginning, is that I did talk to some people that had worked in not in libraries but in research IT, at universities, and their conception of scale was completely different.
Yeah.
And so I think having really forthright discussions about what scale means in the context of the project and the collaboration are really important to kind of head off frustration or charges of value or legitimacy. Like, you really have to kind of agree on what is going to be an impactful project.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes when scale is invoked, it's used sort of amorphously to kind of stop things from moving forward. And so you kind of just have to latch on to that and say, nope, we're going to have a conversation about what scale is going to mean in this particular project.
Yeah.
So I think that's kind of like one tip that I might pass on.
Yeah. Yeah. Sorry, I had a background working in digitisation at a museum, a natural history museum, and everyone who called up to ask for digitisation request, I'd say, how many objects? And they say, oh, not many, which, you know, if you're talking to the mammals, that's 2. If you're talking to the marine invertebrates, that's 7,000. So a very simple version of that challenge about agreeing on scale. I had a question come in, and it's actually slightly perhaps related to that. Sorry, Adam, I'm reordering our discussion, but about came in from one of our colleagues who works as the Dean of Research in a humanities facility, and it says, what is your advice for encouraging or bringing on board researchers in humanities who are used to working with more qualitative approaches to research and take up or learn about computational methods? Have you got any advice on that front?
Yeah, I think my advice, I don't think it's actually too, I don't think it's going to be a very interesting piece of advice. But for me, I think when I've had a lot of consultation with humanities researchers over the years. I started as a digital humanities librarian, and then ended up going much broader, but was really just to focus on like what the particular questions are that are motivating this researcher. And there's often sort of like this teeter-totter. Is teeter-totter a thing in Australia? Do you know what that is? Or is that a colloquialism in the US?
I think it might be a seesaw in Australia.
Seesaw. Okay.
Two kids sit on a plank and go up it. Yeah,
exactly.
I don't know what it is in New Zealand.
I kind of feel like there's this seesaw of apprehension that you're dancing around in these conversations, where a researcher who may have been very secure in their use of particular methods, they have this underlying apprehension around the technology, but at the same time, they have this sense of the possibility of the technology. And, you know, really, the technology, in my opinion, only matters insofar as you have an interesting question. And so for me, when I want to incentivize or help a researcher on that path, I really just focus on having a rich discussion about like what their questions are, rather than digging into, oh, well, you should use computer vision, or, oh, you should use neural networks, or you should, you know, use this, you know, particular kind of algorithm, because that just takes them into this zone that like I don't feel is really that useful.
I guess a slight follow-up from me, and I'm thinking of within the responsible operations document, you do talk around, I guess, some core competencies that people need to upskill. And so thinking of a team here, what are those sort of basic steps that, or that common language that we need to maybe get into people's PDs or into just general conversation, so that when we when we talk about an algorithm, they don't get scared and run away, or they don't want to have that conversation because it's in the too hard basket. And I just wondered again if there's, I don't know, some very simple documents or projects or ideas that you have just to, I guess, start that conversation so that people don't immediately run away.
Yeah, I think to begin with, you need someone who can be that translator between different cultures within an organization, right? That like can kind of weather tension between say an IT group and another part of the organization. But I think going beyond that a little bit more, it can't just be that translational person's responsibility, right? Like, you know, as a manager and as an administrator, you have to set up a culture where that's not gonna be like, you know, being a heat shield on a shuttle that's re-entering the atmosphere in order to, you know, in order to push a collaboration forward. You know, I imagine that space shuttle would be particularly, you know, gendered in nature, and, you know, not a great ship to be in. So I think there's some managerial competencies that I allude to as well around sort of like fostering a culture where people can collaborate in this way. I think, like more like concrete things around competencies and position descriptions and things like that, that's articulated as a challenge in the research agenda, right? So that is an area, it's a challenge area where we need investigation, basically. There are other pieces of that are connected where it's kind of, I just kind of like speculate a little bit around, if we have more people that are competent and that are more competent with data science or machine learning or whatever, like, will that create a retention challenge for us within cultural heritage? And if that is the case, what can we do to make people want to continue to work with us, right? I did have some conversations with some quite senior administrators that would say things like, well, that's a losing game to begin with. Like people work with us for the mission. And I just don't think that that's a sustainable argument, and that we need to think a little bit more imaginatively about wanting to keep people with us and actually support them.
Yep. No, definitely the heat shield. I love that. That's a great. Sometimes
it's like it's like that movie Apollo 13. They're re-entering and it's getting really hot in there. Everything's breaking off the sides.
Flames
of it. Like,
everywhere.
Are they going to survive? Are they going to land in the ocean? Are they going to drown? Is someone going to get them?
I think we all recognise that. We've had a great question come in from Sydney Shep. Thomas, can you talk about ways of freeing up the curatorial gatekeeping of institutions that often want perfection before public release, whereas we have ways of using data that doesn't require radical pre-processing, and in fact the interpretive decisions of curators can get in the way?
Oh, it's a great question. And part of my sense of the past 5 or 6 years of working on the collections as data work, and I'm a librarian, but it's taken me into archives community and museums community as well. And it's given me these glimpses of like these different conventions and cultures around sort of curatorial gatekeeping that are interesting. I would just provide an example, and I like to like part of the reason I like having conversations like this is because like you can just like point to a bunch of people's work that you admire. So I really always recommend people talk to Sonia Renate. She's at the UK National Archives archivist. And I saw her give a fantastic presentation at a computational archival science workshop at the University of Maryland last year on how the UK National Archives is incorporating probabilistically generated description in their public-facing interface, right? So she's an archivist, right? Archivist, provenance, certainty, all that stuff, right? But she's working through very practical ways to account for probability to an end user of an archival collection. So to the extent that they've even done user studies to come up with labels for different degrees of probability to signal to a user the likelihood that different records are connected or not. So it's just really like taking probabilistic description and then squaring it with archival conventions and archival care for provenance and certainty, and then translating it out toward a public-facing audience, but then even doing the user studies beforehand to make sure that labels you assign to different degrees of probability are actually useful to people. Yeah,
that's a really interesting example. And pointing to great people's work is exactly the stage we're at with having this discussion here, is just going, these are some people who've achieved some of these things that we see as, as an opportunity, but not necessarily having the pathway to get there. But that's really, and it's also a really good example of maintaining that professional principle that we can sometimes have concern about. But actually, I have a question that perhaps actually draws on that professional principle question, which is about a question about the relationship between cultural heritage organisations, their collections, and commercial operators. Because many people who, as they implement these things, will be drawing upon commercial tools. And if you've got any sort of experience or observations about the upsides or downsides of using commercial algorithms, and perhaps the other side of that, which is about sharing models and training or test data, because that's a space that I think can be explored. And how we think about that in relation to our core work as well.
Yeah, it's a great question. This question kind of expressed itself in the research agenda as well. Amanda Rust at Northeastern University kind of raised it to me, just sort of concerns around terms of use associated with various cloud-based commercial solutions, and particularly uncertainty around, like whether or not, say, you use a commercial computer vision solution to identify objects in your collection. Like, sure, you're scaling description of your collection, but are you also, training a commercial tool to become better and then potentially be applied for a purpose that would be against your mission? And so at the time of the release of that agenda, I mean, I feel like things have changed a lot, particularly in the United States, around facial recognition technology. A lot of the companies here are starting to stop developing those, but there was concern, right? Like, if you're a cultural heritage organization and you have this backlog of all these historic images, and you're like, wow, it would be great to know all of the instances of Martin Luther King in this huge collection, but then at the same time, like, are you actually training Amazon's recognition tool, which was sold to police departments, to become better at identifying Black faces in protest rallies? So I feel like there's some investigation to go into terms of use, right? So we're not too lured by the possibilities of scale in a way that actually compromises our values.
I think
that's,
yeah,
I was going to say that's something that we've been talking about, and I think struggling with a little bit here is, as a museum, we have a really, the ICOM code of ethics, which states really quite clearly what we should be doing, and some of these commercial entities, it really is sometimes hard to find that line. And the question of, we ask is it better to have a sort of AI generated record online or no record at all? So where's that greater good? Is it providing access rather than waiting 20 years for someone to actually get to that piece of work? And same with other tools, although not AI, things like the Amazon Mechanical Turk, where there's we're not paying a lot of people on those types of sites, and as museums, as cultural organizations, should we not be better? And we're here for the long haul, so we can make good decisions and the right decisions and play a part in, a good role in society. And I think that's something that because you're right, sometimes these things, they look cheap and easy. You can get 10,000 images done for 10 cents or something, and we sometimes maybe jump ahead, and I think we do need to take, back to your point earlier, we need to come up with some terms of how we engage.
Yeah, I that's one of the things that's been really encouraging, I think, for me in engaging like how this work is developing, is that one of the things that I find is like really striking in cultural heritage community, at least as I've engaged it in the US, a bit in Europe, and now a little bit in Australia and New Zealand, is that it seems to be markedly different than the way that the tech sector engages the use of some of these technologies. It does seem that there's a lot of concern about doing this work ethically, doing this work in service to particular communities, which I think is awesome. It's part of the reason why the research agenda is called Responsible Operations. It came from a conversation with Raman Chaudhry at the Responsible AI lead at Accenture, where it's basically just like, I feel like the community is becoming more aware of the ethical pitfalls of some of these things, right? But it's like, I also have heard a real willingness to want to actually operationalize things. Like, how do we create workflows? What do the positions look like? How can we improve discovery? But like, how can we do that responsibly?
Yeah, it's the tension between our communities, and I'd say our community bridging perhaps the cultural collections community and the humanities, arts and social science research that often depends on our community's interest and drive to critique the tools that we're working with and ensure thorough understanding of all impact of that versus the forge ahead and let's achieve new things. And I think that also comes back into that question about scale as well. Like, yep. if we have an ambition for scale, is that going to be selling short some of our principles around those things?
Yeah.
It's interesting, there's been a little discussion going on in the chat, and I thank Janet from the ADA, who and various other Ingrid Masons in the chat here about about career pathways. And Janet has said that she's quite happy for her job title to be heat shield and translator, if it leads to real career paths for IT savvy HAS staff, or humanities, arts, social sciences research staff, and challenging that question that many of our organisations depend upon outsourcing because it becomes a financial decision rather than a how are we doing this work decision. So one of the questions that had come through was about building up computer or data science skills within institutions, and whether what skills and inter-organisational collaboration is going to be required in the future to avoid some of these ethical conundrums.
Yeah, great question. I mean, I think, so training wise, I think the carpentries are fantastic. Many of the people that I spoke to in development of the research agenda, and just for some background, I was a researcher in residence at OCLC Research for the past year, and I spent half my time talking with people a lot and holding meetings and documenting challenges. Ultimately, I had 144 of them that were shared with me, and then synthesizing them into this agenda. And one of them was needs around training, in particular, need for more evidence-based training in this space. So I think the carpentries are good about producing evidence that some of the pedagogy works. I believe I remember seeing something published along the line, but basically that there was a community desire for more evidence-based training, more things like carpentries that are affordable but still compensate instructors or an organization fairly. And currently there aren't a lot of evidence-based options, and I'm going to assume, at the risk of assuming, I'm going to assume that universities aren't radically different than they are in the United States, where, say, if you want to learn more about programming, it's not like the solution is to start taking classes in the computer science major, because it actually takes a number of years before you get to any kind of practical content. So there's a real gap, I think. I think there's also a gap in terms of sort of organizational structures that allow people release time and reimagining their jobs in a way that they can work across departments. I was lucky in that my first job at an academic library was at Michigan State, and I thought that this was a fantastic model. Basically, every librarian could decide what to do with a quarter of their time. So say you were hired into digital collections, Alexis, and you got really interested in, I don't know, copyright. You could say to your supervisor, I want a secondary appointment into copyright. And then you'd have 25% of your time into copyright or into technical services or scholarly communication or whatever. And then the whole librarian staff was like that. So
Wow.
if we had a repository person that got interested in linked open data, and so then got a quarter time appointment into technical services. So the quarter time wasn't even held within the division. It could be sort of matrixed across the organization.
That's
amazing.
That's a stunning idea.
Yeah, it was great.
What did you spend your quarter time on? What did?
So my quarter time was in liaison. Yeah, liaison. So I was 75% time into the digital information is what it was called. So it was basically a repository group and data creation, and then 25% time into linguistics and philosophy.
And I guess my admin brain's going, was that for like 6 months, or was that 12, or was that just ongoing?
The whole like, it was reevaluated at the annual evaluation.
Far out.
Yeah.
That's very
amazing. I don't really
way.
understand like why it's not more common. Yeah.
It's a real genuine commitment to peer learning and cross-fertilization of, because it's not just that you would learn from them, you would bring a perspective to that group as well.
Yeah, and it was really good for people, especially people that were new to the profession, right? Where maybe they didn't know exactly what they wanted to specialize in. So they'd have that grace period of, well, maybe I'll do this or maybe I'll do that. It was nice. It worked.
I mean, we kind of touched on this in that last question, but just, I guess, acknowledging that the Australia and New Zealand is a very different environment organisationally, and we're different organisations, different structures. And I always like to think that New Zealand is kind of, I guess, small enough to be able to do something really good collaboratively together. And I just wondered if putting it out there, any sort of ideas that you would share, that maybe we've got a nice little community here. What kind of collaborative projects could we be looking at, or yeah, how could we learn from each other?
So I gather that in your, I don't think that this is totally idealistic, but I gather that, or impressionistic, I get the impression that you all are better at thinking through models for community engagement. You know, particularly with the indigenous community in that region of the world. I admire the care principles, for example, that came out of the Indigenous Data Network a good amount, which I happened to learn about from a faculty member at the University of Arizona who was part of that. But a big gap that I see in the United States is, you know, struggling through like how to do this work ethically, and then how to work against a history of institutions harming underrepresented communities, misrepresenting them, appropriating knowledge, you know, not a good history, right? And so there's a lot of desire currently and struggle to try and figure out how to become better at that. And I think that our institutions could learn a lot from what you all have been doing, to be honest. So I don't know what we can offer, though. That's just like offering you our struggle.
I wouldn't suggest, that's a work in progress in this environment. And I think one of the challenges, particularly for this community who are interested in computational methods and working at scale, is that a lot of the work that's gone in at that area is at an institutional level, and that cultural safety is something that's considered about, I mean, even being in the physical space or accessing a particular collection. And so when we're talking about access via computational methods, there's a risk, we need a new way of thinking about that to ensure that we're not bypassing measures that have been put in place to remedy some of those, or not remedy, but to address some of those issues. And so that's an interesting challenge for this community.
I think another one could be trying to think through together what it looks, you know, how to aggregate training data from multiple smaller institutions. You know, we obviously have some like gigantic institutions in the United States, but that's kind of like the, I wonder kind of if the collections, if more of the collections are actually in the long tail.
Yeah.
Right. So I don't know if you've ever seen that kind of graph where you have like a peak at the beginning, and that's, you know, so that would be like Smithsonian, Library of Congress, and then the graph goes like this. And if you actually take this piece of the graph, it's actually much lower if it adds up to be almost as big as the beginning. I think that larger institutions are more able to say that they have a representative collection already, whereas a reality for many institutions is that the representative collection is distributed across many smaller institutions. And I think that that's one of the next, or in your case, maybe one of the more immediate, challenges is, you know, how do we unify and create training data across a bunch of smaller institutions?
Yeah, that's an area that I'm really interested in. One part of my motivation in joining in with this network was about an increasing awareness of some of the big data that exists in some of these cultural institutions. In Australia, we have the examples of Trove, their Australian Web Archive, some of the social media collections that we're working with, the electronic collections coming out of our new national e-deposit scheme. So there are some very large pools of big data, which one of the things that I see as that could come out of this work is new ways of interrogating those collections.
Yeah,
but the big win could be this fact that it's actually distributed small data around the place, and how we can connect that in to make it
I think that just the one like related thing around that is that so in addition to sort of joining together to create the training data, is to actually collaborate together on, you know, sharing and improving methods applied to that data. I have this slide that I like using and talking about some of this work that it looks like it's from an anime. It's like a guy like pointing to a butterfly or something. He's like, is this big data? Or do you know what I'm talking about?
Yes, I know this. I know the meme.
It's always hard to talk in memes, but basically it's like, institution applies computer vision to collection, identifies, 10,000 feathers. Is this good?
Yeah.
Is it bad? Is it state of the art? Like, there's a lot of sort of like archipelagic experimentation in cultural heritage space right now with like computer vision, text mining, and natural language processing, and not a lot of venues for us to come together and sort of empirically refine the methods that we're using. So we actually know like that we're improving, or that we have an approach that could be repurposed for a different collection. We don't really have a lot of venues like that in the way that some disciplines do.
Yeah. I think one of the things, the discussions come up in the chat around that is that we're talking that difference between big data and rich data, and that,
Okay.
that in many cases what we're talking, what libraries, archives and museums are able to provide in that long tail is deep data and rich data, and how can we shift some of those methods that may be focused on big data into working with rich data.
Yeah, it's interesting. One of our regrantees, Dominique Luster, at the Carnegie Museum of Art, they're working with an African-American photography collection, super rich data, but the computational challenge there was disambiguating the description so that it was structured into fixed fields. So basically, like so it's in a museum, but it's a photograph collection, and they had item level description for every photograph. In an archive, you wouldn't. So she's an archivist working in a museum with a photograph collection that got item level description. She says she feels because the photographs were held by a museum, so they got the item level treatment. So they have item level description, but then not discoverable because all of the rich description was packed into a single field. So their project, and they actually finished their project. I should share a link to their deliverables, their tool, and so forth, was to apply natural language processing to identify different entities in the huge form description, disambiguate it, and then move it into fixed fields so that the content was discoverable, so that the rich description can actually be used. It's a cool project.
Yeah, no, very, and I think just going back to your earlier point, and I guess also thinking about this group around a lot of organizations sort of doing the silo trials, looking at what they can do, and definitely an opportunity for at least the 53 of us in this chat to start sharing that learnings together at a local level, and for us to start collating what we're all doing and sharing our understanding, because as we can see, there's a bunch of other people who are really interested in this. And so I haven't really got a question or a point there, just acknowledging that this is a good first step in that.
Yeah, perhaps Adam, you're suggesting that people should join the AI4LAM AU New Zealand chapter. We've had
already a member.
We have had a question to come in. Actually, I like this one. Can you talk about creative reuse of cultural data through computational generative means?
Actually, I'm not sure. Can they say more about what they mean, or maybe one of you have a response?
Well, artworks is the answer we've gotten here. I think that's so. We've had quite a lot of discussion today around how we can use artificial intelligence technologies and machine learning and things to amplify, improve, increase efficiency of some of our work practices and some of how people access our collections, those sorts of things. And some of the things that are being done in this space are actually drawing upon those collections for creative purposes. And I've seen, generative poetry, or, using computer vision to create new works, or those sorts of things.
Sure.
Have you got any projects that you're aware of that you'd like to share or describe, or any good collaborations perhaps between any institutions you know of that you've seen that happen?
Yeah, I'll have to think of her. I forgot her last name. Her name's Hannah. I can't remember, but she had some collaborations with MIT where she was creating like sensory experiences based on cultural heritage data, where like the mood of a room would change, like a light would actually change based on different kinds of content. I'll have to look through that. I think on a policy and platform level, it's been around for a while, but I think what the Rijksmuseum has done, encouraging creative reuse of their content, has been quite powerful. I like that they have this thing called the Rijksstudio, where it allows, you know, different people to create sub collections, and they actually have policies that encourage creative, artistic, non-commercial and commercial use, which, you know, it's been my experience. I started maybe 10 years ago at the Library of Congress, and I remember, and at that time I was working with a program that developed content to encourage, I don't know what you call it, we call it K through 12, like elementary, middle school, and high school teachers, to teach with digital collections. And they were stymied so often by the rights statement that would say, you know, rights assessment is your responsibility. So I think with like the creative reuse space, it doesn't necessarily apply to AI, but just like explicitly saying you can do whatever the heck you want, or you can do specifically what they could do, what they can't do, would be super helpful on the creative. And I'll have to look up Hannah's work, and I'll put that in the chat. I'll share it with Ingrid because I think it's super interesting.
Yeah. I think we might gather some of these links. There's been some really interesting links shared in the chat. We perhaps might send them to participants after the fact as well. We're getting a little bit close to the end of our time, but we've got one question. This might be the last question that we look at from the chat window, which was from Samaya in Sydney. It says, how do very small organisations, potentially those organisations that are run by First Nations people or community run, get into this space when they don't have the skills or knowledge? Do they have to collaborate with the big end of town, national institutions or researchers or academia? And what's the bare minimum that a small cultural organisation or individual can do, especially when there might be an organisation that has the cultural First Nations community knowledge, but not necessarily the technical chops to participate? Good question.
Yeah, that's a good, nice, easy one, right? Toward the end.
Yeah. That's good. And a couple of minutes.
Yeah, so I do just want to share really quickly the link in the chat to it's Hannah Davis is the data artist that I was mentioning, works with machine learning and AI. Fantastic work and ethically grounded work. So I put that in the chat.
Thanks.
With the, you know, collaboration with, I mean, that's hard. I mean, I wish I had a better answer. So, you know, I periodically return to this collections as data regranting project that I have, and to 12 institutions currently that we're supporting, and 2 of them work with indigenous communities. One of them has indigenous community members on the project team. The second one aims to do a lot of indigenous community engagement, which is being complicated by COVID-19, because there have been plans to physically like go to these communities, and now there are challenges around using, you know, virtual platforms and whether or not that sort of takes the knowledge out of the land. And I don't know. I don't think I really have a good answer for this one, other than to acknowledge that larger, well-resourced institutions should tread really carefully, and that they should think really critically about a history of discrimination, and they should think about assumptions as to whether or not they are wanted in some of these collaborations. You know, I've seen over the years some kind of gross opportunism that can happen around, especially when there are big external funding calls, where you kind of get this parachute effect of well-resourced institutions into indigenous communities for collaborations. And it's been my experience that no one is fooled by that. Yeah. So not really an answer. I think it's more just like, if you're working for like a well-resourced institution, like acknowledge that there's a bad history and don't be a jerk, and don't assume that people want to collaborate with you. It's like being the popular kid, like you think you're the popular kid or something, and I think you're not, right? So
I think there's an experience in Australia that's being explored, particularly through some of the Indigenous Data Network initiatives that are happening here, about the fact that that's been an extractive process for many of those Indigenous communities, and that's something which we really have to not just address and acknowledge, but also look at how we change things, our practices as we move forward, and ensure that there's community control of some of these things as well.
Yeah, that's one of the things that I really like in the care principles, is that authority to control. I think where that can fall down a little bit is, more institutions here in the US have started to engage in community discussions about what to do with collections that represent particular communities. And I think they kind of skirt around the implications of authority to control, right? So the institution holds the collections, they have the conversation, they say that they want to open things up to community need, and they sort of dance around the idea of like, hey, maybe this collection actually shouldn't be held in our institution, and maybe there should be some authority to control that happens here. I think that that's kind of the next step.
Yeah. This is a really interesting conversation, and perhaps a topic for a future webinar. But we are getting very close to the end of our time, so I am going to wrap up this conversation here. I would like to express my very sincere thanks to Thomas for spending time with us today, and for your generosity with your information. I think it's been a fairly stimulating and wide-ranging conversation. I'd like to particularly thank Ingrid and Jean, who've been working behind the scenes, the real Ingrid, who we can see here, working behind the scenes to keep the links shared and the chat open. As I mentioned in my opening, this is the very first event that's being hosted by the Australian and New Zealand chapter for AI4LAM. Ingrid and Jean have some information ready to go in the chat window, I think, to indicate how you can get further involved in this network. But one thing, while we have what seems to be a fairly excellent group of people here on the line, all called Ingrid, but that's great, they're obviously a sign of their excellence, is that we are interested in holding further presentations and conversational events like this. So if you have projects that you're interested in showcasing, or topics that you would like to see explored in future discussions, I'd really strongly like to encourage you to get in touch with us. So thank you very much for joining us this morning and this afternoon, Thomas. And I really appreciate the time that you've given us today, Thomas. And yeah, well done.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
That was great, Thomas. Lots of behind the scenes chats. That was just terrific.
Very good.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Okay. Bye, everybody.
Bye. See you again.
Yeah, definitely.